In this video, we bring a clean installation of macOS Big Sur to the Windows 10 desktop with the assistance of VirtualBox. Hello everyone, and welcome to TechFixFlix. Following our earlier tutorials in which we installed High Sierra, Mojave and Catalina on Windows 10 using VirtualBox, we once again return to this topic, this time performing a clean installation of macOS Big Sur. If you've followed any of our previous tutorials, the fundamentals remain unchanged, although the process is now significantly streamlined, bypassing the boot loops and requirements for third-party APFS support, which needed to be addressed in those previous videos, for an altogether more straightforward experience. One thing which remains unchanged is our commitment to a clean installation, which sets our method apart from the vast majority available on the web. Following those methods, users are encouraged to download a pre-prepared VDI, VHD or VMDK file, and whilst these methods may be more readily available and far more straightforward to execute, they also carry with them data security risks associated with downloading a hard drive prepared by a third party. Following our method means we create our own installation media, exercising control over its creation, and not placing our data security in the hands of others. It's for this reason that we're unable to offer assistance via the comments to anyone who isn't following our method, as we have no knowledge as to how these third-party installer files have been created. Of course, this means our method presents a significant barrier to access, namely that the initial steps require access to a physical Mac for around an hour. This remains an absolute prerequisite for the project, both in terms of accessing the installer app via the App Store, and more significantly executing the createinstallmedia command, which currently can only be performed using the terminal application on macOS. Unless and until a method can be found to perform these tasks using Windows, it remains the case that our starting point must be access to a machine running macOS. We're also commonly asked to provide copies of the ISO files our project creates. Again, unfortunately this would be both in breach of Apple's terms and conditions, as well as a violation of copyright, and therefore we're unable to assist here, no matter how politely or insistently you ask. We've segmented this tutorial into 9 chapters, allowing you to bypass any content which you may not need, and you'll see the timecode for each of the chapters on screen now. We begin on macOS by downloading the installer file directly from the App Store, before creating an ISO file from the installer app by executing 7 commands in terminal. Incidentally, all of the commands used in this tutorial are reproduced in the written description accompanying this video, allowing you to cut and paste them directly into your project, so we'd urge you to make use of the description as widely as possible. We need to convert the installer to ISO format, as this is the input format accepted by VirtualBox, and our next step is to transfer that ISO from our Mac to Windows. We then need to install VirtualBox on our Windows PC, before configuring the virtual Mac hardware on which the operating system will be run. The virtual hardware alone isn't quite enough to run macOS, so we'll additionally input between 7 and 9 commands using the Windows command prompt. We can then run our virtual machine, configuring the macOS installation, before progressing through the standard setup for the out-of-box experience. Finally, we'll access the Big Sur desktop before turning to further issues which we'd like to resolve. We've learned from experience that these projects evolve over time. We essentially have 4 moving parts in motion, namely the version of macOS we use to create the installer, and here we're using Catalina 10.15, the version of the macOS installer software, which in this case is 11.0.1, the version of the host machine operating system, in this instance Windows 10 Pro version 19042.630, and the version of VirtualBox, which is 6.1.16. Why have we spelt this out? This video will be watched at various times over the coming months and years, and during that time there'll be updates to each of these components, which may fundamentally change aspects of the installation and how they interact with each other. We'd urge you to check the description and comments for any significant developments since this video was published. Finally, the Big Sur installer is certainly larger than those we've used in previous videos, with the initial download currently a little over 12GB, and the finalised ISO weighing in at around 16GB. When processing these files on macOS, make sure that you have at least double the initial file size available, in order to prevent errors which originate from lack of space. We'd suggest a minimum of 30GB free, and somewhere closer to 50 might be beneficial. We begin at our macOS desktop, and here we're using Catalina running in a virtual machine, although we've tested this process with versions as far back as High Sierra. We click to open the App Store. If Big Sur isn't immediately offered, we can search for it via the search box. If you aren't offered Big Sur at all, it may be that the physical Mac you're using isn't on the compatibility list. Even if you aren't intending to update this Mac, it must be compatible with Big Sur in order for the update to be offered. Where this occurs, you may need to take an intermediate step of creating a virtual Mac with a more recent version by following one of our previous tutorials. Otherwise, we simply click to view the app and select the option to get. There's a brief pause as the update is located, and we need to confirm the download by clicking the appropriate button. The download process begins, and at just over 12GB at the time of this video's publication, may offer the opportunity to take a break until its conclusion. We'll take this opportunity to mention that this video doesn't run in real time, but rather is timed to match the commentary, so do be aware that phases like this download may take significantly longer than depicted. Once the download is complete, we don't wish to continue because we're not updating this Mac. We therefore head to the menu in the upper left, selecting the option to quit the installer. With the installer app closed, the software update utility detects further updates on your host machine, which may or may not be the case with your Mac. We simply click to close, before also closing the App Store, returning us to our desktop. Whilst we haven't updated the host machine, clicking to open Finder and navigating to Applications reveals a new addition, namely the Install macOS Big Sur.app. The app needs to be located in the Applications folder in order for the typed commands to work as intended, and if you've downloaded or moved it to any other location, you'll need to place a copy in the Applications folder. As the availability of installer apps can be withdrawn by Apple at any time, we'd advocate maintaining a personal library of these apps for use in future projects. Whilst here, we click the Utilities folder and open Terminal. With Terminal now running, we need to enter 7 separate commands. Each of these can be copied from the written description. The first command creates an empty disk image of the size specified, whilst the second mounts the image. The third will make the image bootable using the createinstallmedia command, but not before asking us to supply a password, and this is straightforwardly your password used to log on to the host Mac at the start of every macOS session. Note that the password is entered silently, and there'll be no indication of the characters you're typing. Upon completion, we see the image visually represented on the desktop. The fourth command ejects the image, allowing us to perform further conversion operations which wouldn't be possible were it to remain mounted. With the image ejected, the remaining 3 commands further convert through DMG, CDR, and ISO formats. We see the CDR file upon its creation, and its subsequent conversion to ISO format, before the outstanding DMG file is also removed via the final command. With our commands entered, we can now close Terminal. The output of the processes to date is this ISO file, which contains a bootable version of the macOS installer and can be used directly as the installation media for a virtual machine. The next step is to transfer this file to Windows. We suspect that the intended audience for this video won't require too much assistance in transferring a file from macOS to Windows, so we'll only briefly outline your options here. Whichever method you use, we'd advocate checking to ensure that the file transfers completely, either via checksum or by comparing file sizes before and after transfer. By far the most straightforward method is via USB stick, memory card, or external drive. Given that the ISO is more than 16GB in size, you'll need a 32GB or greater capacity device to complete the task, copying from the Mac and pasting to a chosen location on your Windows machine. Burning to a physical disk isn't particularly practical, as this would require a Blu-ray recorder on the Mac side and an equivalent reader on the PC. Splitting the file between disks for transmission shouldn't be considered, as the potential for corruption is high. Where the machines are connected to the same network, you can transfer a file directly using the steps outlined in the tutorial shown on screen now, or indirectly using a NAS drive as an intermediary. If the Mac hosting the ISO is a virtual machine, you can use the technique shown in this video to ensure that the Mac has access to its host and the wider network. Whichever way you achieve this, the objective is straightforwardly to copy the ISO from its current location on the Mac to an accessible location on the Windows machine. We now turn to the installation of VirtualBox, which is a utility designed to allow a host machine to run a guest operating system in a virtual environment. For the purposes of this video, that makes it a mechanism by which we can run macOS on PC. VirtualBox can be downloaded from the link shown on screen now, and again reproduced in the description. Clicking the link labelled Windows Hosts downloads the VirtualBox installer, which we click to run. Despite its popularity and ubiquity, Windows surprisingly describes this as an unverified app, and we can either click to install anyway, or change the way Windows handles future permissions of this type by clicking Change My App Recommendation Settings, clicking the drop down, and from the list which appears, selecting Anywhere. With that setting confirmed for future use, we return to the VirtualBox installation, clicking Next to proceed. We would draw your attention to the networking options, and in particular, we'd advocate ensuring that both will be installed on the local hard drive, as this will open up the networking capabilities of your virtual Mac. You may wish to accept the default installation location, or follow our example and enter a custom path. In either event, you should keep a record of the full installation path, as this will be essential when inputting the commands via the command prompt later in the tutorial. We can happily accept the defaults of the following screen by clicking Next. We are warned that proceeding with the next phase of the installation will disrupt our network connection, and you should be aware of this if, for example, performing a background download. Once we click Yes, we are given a final opportunity to backtrack before clicking Install. Where user account control queries our intentions, we can either simply click Yes to proceed, or follow the instructions in this tutorial to permanently suppress these messages. Once dealt with, the installation proceeds to conclusion. Clicking Finish launches the main interface, which will expand to full screen. To start creating a new virtual machine, we simply click on the New icon. We've switched away to our regular VirtualBox installation, which already has a pre-configured Windows virtual machine. If this is your first time with VirtualBox, you won't see any existing data. Having clicked New, the Create Virtual Machine dialog appears, and our first task is to provide the machine with a name. We've opted for Big Sur, which is very literal. You have an entirely free choice, but be aware that you'll need to recall this name exactly as it's written here, in the typed commands used in the next section of the video. Next, we click the Type drop-down, using it to select macOS 10, even though we've finally progressed to 11 with the introduction of Big Sur. Be on the lookout for version 11 being specifically catered for if you're watching this video sometime after its release. With the type set, we click the version drop-down, moving down to the 64-bit version. If you're using a 32-bit machine, 64-bit options naturally won't be available to you. If you're using a 64-bit machine and still can't see 64-bit options, you should initially check your BIOS settings to ensure that virtualization or an equivalent setting has been enabled. We've now completed the first page of configuration information and can click Next to continue. The next step is to allocate RAM to the virtual machine. You can't simply allocate all of your host's RAM here, as you need to leave sufficient memory for the operation of the host machine, and around half will be appropriate. So if you have a 4GB machine, we'd recommend allocating 2GB to the virtual machine. But if you have 8GB, you can allocate 4 to the virtual machine, and so on. As we're using a 64GB host, and allocating half would be overkill, we allocate 8GB to the virtual machine, before clicking Next to proceed. We now come to allocation of a virtual hard disk file, and we'll click Create here, accepting the default option to create the virtual hard disk now. We'll also accept the default type at the following screen by again clicking Next. We typically opt for dynamically allocated storage, allowing the disk to increase proportionately with our usage, although fixed size may offer better performance. Clicking Next takes us to the location and size parameters. We'll simply accept the default location, noting that we could move this file wherever we can accommodate, and we'll increase its size from the default 20GB to a still modest 50GB. Whilst this is fine for testing purposes, you may wish to allocate significantly more where you have particular usage cases in mind. Clicking Create completes the initial configuration, and we can see our new machine listed. We do, however, need to expand upon that initial setup. With the machine selected, we click Settings, moving immediately to the System tab. By default, provision is made for a floppy drive, now long obsolete, so we untick that option, then click the Processor tab. We need to move this slider from 1 to 2, and this is crucial as Big Sur requires at least 2 cores. Failing to make this change will prevent your virtual machine from starting. We then navigate to Display, where we increase video memory to the maximum permitted by the GUI. Incidentally, this limit can be doubled using the method shown in this tutorial. Having made bridged networking available during VirtualBox setup, we now move to the networking options, clicking the drop-down and selecting Bridged Adapter. This will allow our virtual Mac to see other devices on the local network. We can click OK to close the window. Our configuration is complete, but we do need to add some additional commands via the command prompt to ensure that our machine will run. We therefore click the Start button, typing CMD and clicking to run as administrator. Again, we may need to confirm with user account control before being taken to the command prompt window. Once again, all of the commands we enter here can be copied from the written description. It's vital that the commands which follow are executed in the correct directory, so our first task is to point the system in the correct direction, or risk an error message querying the validity of the commands. We therefore type CD, then press space, then open quotation marks, and enter the full pathway to our VirtualBox installation, before closing the quotation marks. Not only do we need to do this now, but we'll also need to do this in future if we decide to return and add in extra commands. We've placed the default VirtualBox installation pathway in the description, but should you have entered a custom installation path, much like us, you'll need to enter the correct path here. When we press enter, we see confirmation that the pathway before the prompt changes from Windows System 32 to our VirtualBox directory. Note that this is the only time we see any visual confirmation of our commands being entered. Commands will now be executed in that directory until we close the current command prompt session. Should we leave command prompt and then look to add further commands, we would again need to first specify the installation directory. There now follows a series of 6 commands, each entered in sequence. These commands appear to have been inherited from the Hackintosh community, and their precise function is somewhat vague. Nevertheless, we've tried this process without them, and can confirm that they are definitely required. We now turn to an optional command, which will control the display resolution of your virtual Mac. Note that 1920 by 1080 represents the dimensions of the display window. We can accommodate this because we're running on a 3840 by 2160 monitor. A 1920 by 1080 resolution couldn't accommodate this setting without scroll bars, unless running in full screen mode. This is because the virtual window has upper and lower toolbars, which must be accommodated within the overall display area. You should therefore allocate dimensions which are smaller than your host machine's native resolution. Finally, an optional command which has proven very helpful for users of AMD processors. As macOS anticipates an Intel platform, it can refuse to work with AMD. Adding the command shown on screen now convinces the software it's running on an Intel processor, allowing it to run. We use this as a classic example, and you may wish to experiment by updating the CPU profile to something more recent. We don't execute this command, as we're already running on Intel, so we simply close the command prompt window. We're very close to running our virtual machine. We now simply need to tell it to boot from our macOS ISO. Returning to VirtualBox and selecting our virtual machine, we right-click, selecting Settings, and navigating from General to Storage. We then click on the empty virtual optical drive, then click on the downward pointing arrow, selecting Choose a disk file from the menu which appears. We then navigate to wherever we've placed the ISO we created on the Mac, selecting it and clicking to open. We see that it's now attached to the virtual optical drive. Incidentally, we've seen this file become detached on first run of the virtual machine, so if your installation halts on first run after a few seconds, return to this screen to verify that the ISO is still attached, and reattach if necessary. Our virtual Mac is finally running, and you'll now see very many white lines of text on a black background. The rule here is that as long as new lines of text are appearing, or the drive light indicator at the bottom of the VirtualBox window is still flashing, you should assume that all is well, even if you're seeing error messages in the white text, which is entirely normal. Only if the text fails to update after 2 to 3 minutes, with no drive activity, should you be concerned. Don't wait for more than 5 minutes for this screen to update, as this is too long. After the first wave of white text, you'll see the familiar Apple logo and progress bar, and once the bar is filled, the screen will fade to grey before the language selection screen appears. We select UK English before clicking the arrow to advance. We arrive at the recovery screen, where the immediate temptation is to click on Install macOS Big Sur, but this will take you down an incorrect path, as having progressed through the screens which follow, we eventually reach a screen where there are no disks to be found on which macOS can be installed. We therefore rewind to the recovery environment, this time selecting Disk Utility before clicking to continue. The Disk Utility screen appears, and we navigate to VBOX HARDDISK media, immediately noticing that this is uninitialized, which is why it wasn't discovered in our first run. We therefore click the Erase button, which takes us to this dialog. We make a cosmetic choice to rename the main hard drive, then click Erase. The erasing process begins, and the drive is quickly ready for use. Clicking Done returns us to the disk utility window, which we can also close. With that, we return to the main menu, this time selecting macOS Big Sur and clicking Continue. We click Continue a second time at the splash screen, then agree to the license terms, clicking a second time by way of confirmation. Now we see that the drive which we've initialized is available to receive the installation, and we select that drive before clicking Continue. The first phase of installation begins, and as it reaches its conclusion, we are taken to a further screen of white text on a black background. After several moments, we are returned to the classic Apple progress screen, this time offering a specific indication of the time remaining. This is a much longer phase of installation and offers an opportunity to take a break. At its conclusion, we are sent back for a further phase of text, and this cycle repeats on 2 more occasions. And after the final progress bar fills, the screen fades to grey before we see our first splash of Big Sur colour. Excited yet? In several test runs, our mouse slowed to a crawl over the next phase, so you may need a degree of patience and keyboard control to navigate successfully. This is also by far the most straightforward part of the installation, and it's truly plain sailing from here. Obviously, whilst we'd suggest closely following the tutorial up to this point, from here onward the choices are very much personal to you. We select United Kingdom as our location before clicking Continue, and this pre-populates our written and spoken language choices, which we accept in the same way. We're fortunate not to require any of the accessibility options covered here, but we're pleased to see them prominently available for those who do. We skip simply by clicking Not Now. We again jump through the following screen by selecting Continue, and we won't be migrating any data, preferring instead to select Not Now. This screen is often controversial. We opt not to sign in, given that our virtual Mac is decidedly non-standard and a breach of Apple's terms and conditions. We've received feedback via the comments from people who have signed in, reportedly without incident, and we've promised to visit them in prison next week. Again, we're invited to confirm our intention to skip the sign-in. We next need to accept the terms and conditions, which we've already broken, by clicking Agree, and again confirming when prompted. As we've skipped the Apple ID sign-in, we're prompted to create a local account, where entering our full name automatically populates the account name field. We can amend our icon, selecting defaults and picking from the available options before clicking Save. We now need to enter our password, and having done so, we enter it a second time by way of confirmation. We leave the hint field blank to minimise potential hacking risk. We opt to customise our settings rather than accept the setup defaults, and location services are disabled by default, allowing us to click Continue and again confirm. Time zone selection is performed by clicking the map or typing directly in the box, and confirming via drop-down before clicking Continue. At the Analytics screen, we deselect the data sharing option before clicking Continue. For those of you who like torturing your offspring by limiting their screen time, there are options for you, but don't use them because it's evil. Instead, we select Setup Later. We leave the option to ask Siri enabled. Although our present virtual hardware limitations seem to prevent microphone access, we're hoping that a future fix might resolve this, bringing Siri into play. Although we do select Not Now when asked for further requests for data sharing. When it comes to choosing our look, we'll always go for the light, and clicking Continue begins a final phase of automated setup. After a long journey, the next screen took us by surprise, being entirely black on multiple test runs. We'll address that momentarily. In the meantime, we click Continue to perform keyboard identification, where pressing the key to the right of left shift correctly identifies our keyboard layout. But now, nothing but blackness. In our early runs, we reset the machine at this point, but simply waiting will also see the arrival of the full desktop experience. We suspect the lag seen during the installation spills over into the first few moments on the desktop. Cleaning up the final business from the installation, we right-click the installer ISO, and from the menu which appears, we select the option to eject. We'd again recommend retaining these ISO files in a personal archive, as they can be used to create future virtual machines when needed. We have now achieved our goal of running macOS Big Sur within Windows. As with previous incarnations of this project, two major issues still remain. Firstly, the absence of sound devices for both input and output appears to be a limitation of the VirtualBox environment, or possibly more accurately, the absence of drivers appropriate to this environment. The second is a general performance lag. Obviously, we're emulating a powerful modern operating system, so it will never equal physical Mac hardware, but any additional performance benefit would be helpful. As ever, if you have any observations which might carry the project forward, we'd be delighted to hear from you, and we'll report back with any significant developments, or with the next significant macOS release. Don't forget to check out our back catalogue and subscribe for our future projects. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you found it useful, please consider subscribing by clicking the logo on screen now. If you'd like to see more, there are 2 suggestions currently on screen. If you have a better, faster or more economical solution, let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. You're also welcome to follow us on Twitter. Until your next tech fix, goodbye.